All right. Well, let me admit the next crew in here and we'll open in prayer. And if I see Charles Madry, that must mean they got home from church. Rose has got him muted.
George, there are two policemen behind me, but I gave them your address.
No worries. No worries. They have souls that need saving too. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Days pass and the years vanish as we walk sightless among miracles. Lord, fill our eyes with seeing and our minds with knowing. Let there be moments when your presence, like lightning, illumines the darkness in which we walk. Help us to see wherever we gaze that the bush burns unconsumed. And we, clay touched by God, will reach out for holiness and exclaim in wonder, how filled with awe is this place, and we did not know it. How filled with awe is this place, and we did not know it. Amen. We are continuing to go through the Gospel of Mark, and I raced through a lot of the literary style and strategy last time. I know many of you had to go in the middle of my recounting of the apocalyptic ideal, so we'll rehash some of that. But I'm wondering if, just to start, there are any questions that it would be helpful to address. All right, hearing none, I'm going to assume all was understood. Ponder deeply in your heart over the week, and we'll keep on going. All right. Well, we talked last week a bit about the Greek in which Mark was written, and most importantly, perhaps the political orientation of Mark. I suggested that when we look, for example, at miracle stories, I wanted you to look not only at the healing of the ears and the eyes, but also the idea that the person suffering was brought from the margins back to the center of society, and that maybe the healing had as much to do with the restoration of that person as being a worthy, qualifying member of society as it did the restoration of whatever faculty may have been the beneficiary of the healing. Those metaphors, of course, also work on a spiritual level. Those who have ears to hear and eyes to see are able to see and hear what is immaterial, what is invisible, what is the presence of God, not subject to our normal five senses. And I think that works well in the Gospel of Mark, and in particular those healing stories. I also suggested that intertextual references were very important. We really did a deep dive on this concept with respect to the Gospel of John, and we're going to do it again in Mark. That is, the use by Mark of Hebrew scriptures and, frankly, other literary genres to make his point, understanding what he's pulling from and whether he's affirming or contrasting with that source is critical to the underlying meaning of the gospel. I addressed this point by implication in my sermon this morning. We're talking about Ascension Day. The gospel reading is from Luke, but it's hard, at least for me, to hear those words from Luke, which are simple. Jesus simply disappears into the sky, without also hearing the text in Acts, which of course is written by the same author as the Gospel of Luke, in which there are two men clothed in white who provide a little bit of context that Jesus is going away, but Jesus is going to come back, and you'll see him in exactly the way you saw him leave, which has in its own a reference back to the imagery of Daniel, the apocalyptic vision of the prophet Daniel, who sees the human one descend from the clouds and dominate or exercise dominion over all of the nations of the world. That sense of Daniel gets picked up in Acts, which is picked up in Luke. If you just read the words of Luke all by themselves, you might have some idea of what the ascension is, but when you add it, all the rest of it to it, you get a much different idea. And I think it is the adding which gives you this idea of the second coming, which I pushed back on this morning, suggesting I think that's not the right interpretation of Jesus's message. But regardless, you can't have the conversation if you aren't aware of the intertextual references. And the same will be true in the Gospel of Mark. Nowhere is that more true, I think, than in his use of the apocalyptic literature. There's an ideology of genre there that is important for what Mark is saying. And I was suggesting that just as prophets predicting the future is more about a deep understanding and insight into what the future will look like if we don't change our evil ways, than a prediction of what's going to happen because somehow they have privileged insight into the future. Do you see that difference? The same is true as apocalyptic. It's not, here's what the end of the world is going to look like, as much as, in very dramatic terms, here is a revelation of what is really happening and the ultimate damage that it could cause if not averted. So to look at prophetic literature and apocalyptic literature is to look at an unveiling, at a revelation of what's really going on. And that is, of course, part and parcel what we believe spiritual maturity, Christian maturity entails, is an ability through expansion of consciousness or transformation of our being to see more than we would otherwise see. To see, as I said this morning, with the eye of our heart and not just with the eyes in our head, which lets us discern the movement of the Spirit in the world around us and to align ourselves more completely with it. All of that is going on in the Gospel of Mark. So there were 6 basic characteristics of apocalyptic narrative, and I'm going to repeat them. I hope it'll be a helpful review, but also I didn't even start this until after the hour had passed. So I know some of you justifiably had to move on to other things. The first would be that the meaning of the crisis that you're in, this only arises when there's some crisis that needs to be addressed, is really a clue to the culmination of history, a clue to how things are going to work out if we aren't careful. There's a lot of apocalyptic literature in the Gospels, and of course there is the book of Revelation. They all demonstrate this characteristic. The second characteristic is radical dualism. There's an old order and a new order. There's a new heaven and a new earth, a new wine and old wineskins. There's a constant comparison of old and new. You are probably most used to this dynamic in what's sometimes called the hero stories, where there's a journey of the hero that is discernible, at least typically the male hero anyway, which is discernible. And it's often spoken of in 3 basic parts. There's an order and a disorder and a reorder. And the way the hero moves through that tends to be somewhat formulaic. If you know that story, which Joseph Campbell and Hero with 1,000 Faces spoke a lot about, you can discern it in an awful lot of stuff. So for example, I used to do a men's retreat where I used the River Wye, which was a wonderful old story of fly fishing, and the hero was a fly fisherman, but you could go back and use the hero's journey that was used by Homer and map it out against this 1980s film about fly fishing and see very clearly how one stage moved to another. The dramatic plot was literally taken out of Homer and used again. The same is true, I think, with the Gospel of Mark. I've seen a really fascinating analysis of Mark based on Homer, where the critic literally took the epic and took things out of it and showed how parts of Mark frankly, if you didn't know which was which, you might have actually mistaken the two. I wasn't ultimately persuaded that's what the author did, but the fact that the similarity exists, I think, is meaningful. And it is a way of showing how these powers are juxtaposed against each other and how conflict works its way out. So knowing that structure is there will help you read Mark. And Mark will, in fact, go from order to disorder to reorder. The order, which is either in the first book of Mark, the first part of Mark, which is kind of about the Jewish society, and the second part looks to be about the temple, and that's all challenged and subverted in the way Mark talks about it. And of course, the reordering is the kingdom that Jesus introduces. And so you can see this transition from order through disorder through reorder as Mark, using the protagonist Jesus, attempts to subvert the power of the existing order in order to show light on the future order. I've argued in the past that this structure looks a lot like Beatrice Brutteaux's concept of domination and friendship. You'll remember the two paradigms that she sketches out based on the Maundy Thursday liturgies: foot washing, in which Jesus subverts the order of domination by becoming the servant who washes the feet of the disciples, and the Eucharist in the second part of the Maundy Thursday liturgy, where friendship is the prevailing paradigm. There is no power dominating any other. To be fully part of that group is to serve the group, is to sacrifice your life for the group. That's an example too of order and disorder and reorder, with the new paradigm being one of friendship. So you'll see a lot of the dualism in Mark, and I want you to pay attention to it when you see, even in what may be fleeting metaphors, you pay attention when you've got old and new. Mark is saying something, he's tying that to a larger theme. And you'll see this particularly in Mark 4 and 13, where he talks about a new age and an old age. There's the combat myth, which again plays directly into the Homer epics. See Jesus with Satan in the wilderness, for example, right after his baptism, or the whole metaphor of the strong man and breaking into the strong man's house and binding the strong man. I think all of those are metaphorical structures that are opposing the old order and the new order, or the powers of this world and the powers of the kingdom. So that the real question becomes, who is Lord? To whom do we worship? Where do we place our fealty? The fourth characteristic is secret revelation. Here, I'm not talking about esoteric knowledge the way the Gnostics viewed it, for example, where the elite, the educated, the privileged, those with leisure to do such things, are given some kind of secret knowledge, and by virtue of knowing that, they are saved. Instead, this is secret revelation, which is in Mark given to the uneducated, given to those who are not elite, but instead are peasants or commoners, articulated in very common agrarian stories, things taken from ordinary life. It's made available, if you will, not to the elite, but to everyone. That in and of itself is subversive, and that subversiveness, I think, is intentional. The fifth characteristic would be the suffering of the just, and the idea that the mere presence of that and the focus on that has its own subverting power and its own reordering power. Today, we might talk about empathy, for example, and just the awareness of the suffering of another draws us without thinking into assisting the other. I heard a wonderful story this week by a philosopher at the University of Chicago. Her name is Agnes Callard, C-A-L-L-A-R-D. And she was telling the story of raising her son. And she said that at one point, her son told her that he didn't want to go to the playground anymore because the kids kept taking his toys. And she thought, okay, so she tried to pay attention to that. And the next time she went to the playground, she realized what was happening. He would be off by himself playing with a shovel that was, by the way, provided by the playground. And another child would come up and want the shovel. And because they wanted the shovel or needed the shovel or were envying his use of the shovel, he would give it to them. But when he retold the story, they took it from him. And her conclusion was his sensitivity, his natural empathy was such that he couldn't say no. And so in a way, it was taken from him. So he wanted to go to the playground when nobody else was around so that he could play with his toys in peace, right? And so she then goes on to talk about this fascinating kind of parenting lesson of how to say no and how to create your own boundaries, and then speculates about whether our social structures, this would be interesting as a perspective on Mark, whether our social structure, the limitations of our society, our law and order and et cetera, are about constraining our violence, our evil, our tendency to do harm to one another, or whether they're actually about constraining our altruism, our natural desire to do good for another, to empathize with another, that we actually, as demonstrated by our son, need restraints on being totally available to everybody all the time. We have to have some boundaries, and society, by delineating our duties to one another, our responsibilities as citizens, will give us some boundaries. Some of us actually get boundaries from that. I must admit, I had never thought about this before. And my immediate reaction is, aren't you naive? But the more I listened and read her, I realized she is not naive at all. And I'm going to ponder this, and you should ponder it too. I think it's fascinating. Do we have restrictions to protect us from our own excessive empathy and generosity and fellow feeling? Or is it to govern our tendency towards violence or doing harm to each other? Because we're Anglicans, I know that you know that the answer is yes, it's all of that. But I'd never thought about needing a restraint on altruism before. So if you get nothing else out of this class, you might ponder that for a while. And wouldn't it be great if that were our biggest problem, that we needed to restrain this altruism that we all feel so deeply? But we do believe, and this is important for Mark, we do believe that the suffering of the just is somehow effective in bringing down the old order, right? The civil rights movement is premised upon this idea. The nonviolence of Gandhi and Martin Luther King and others is premised on this idea that there's something about that that can speak to us, no matter how obscured or hidden the divine presence is within us. It can and will react to the suffering of another. Just by the way our brains are structured, we're inclined to do that. And I might say there also that, at least to my mind, one of the ways that civilization progresses is drawing the circle more widely or broadly around who is it that we actually have duties of care for? Who is it that our natural empathy extends to? I think as we continue to evolve, it feels to me like we have all these boundaries, this kind of tribalistic looking at things that create boundaries that say, I owe my duty to you, but not to you, or I owe duties of fellow feeling to you, but not to you. And part of expanding that with Christianity, I think, does very explicitly, in its ideals anyway, is expanding the boundary of those to whom we owe those duties. We say in our baptismal covenant that we respect the dignity of every human being. That is, we're drawing the circle more widely or broadly so that you have a dignity that I must respect. It cannot be taken from you. It's inherent in your creation. Other things you have to earn. Other things you may not naturally have, but dignity you do, and I've got to respect that. It's part of my duty as being a child of God, is to recognize your status as a child of God. You're going to see a lot of that in Mark, and a lot of that's going to be part of the Apocalyptic too. So I want to highlight it and just talk about the power of nonviolence generally. One of the things I'll discuss later is the idea that, which I got from Ta-Nehisi Coates, those of you who have read anything by Coates, the idea of applying the principles of nonviolence to the state. Now, we're used to thinking about, or I am used to thinking about the principles of nonviolence as applied to the protesters, as applied to those of us as citizens who want to protest the order, the injustice of the order, that there are ways we should do that that are better than others and they're nonviolent. But the truth is that our state is structured where the monopoly on violence is actually relegated to the state, is retained by the state. So what would it look like if the state operated on principles of nonviolence as well? I'm not saying that means you can't carry guns or can't have a military. That's not what it means, I think. It is instead a primacy given to the dignity of people, to the sanctity of life. And so that when I'm justified in my use of force changes, right? Because if I can preserve life, then I want to preserve life. You know, I want you to just think about that. We'll talk about it more later, but it really, we're, I think, wrestling with that right now. And when is it appropriate to use force? What behavior on the part of this group enables that group to justifiably use force? And I think that's a conversation worth having. And from a Christian perspective, we can have it without getting lost in arguments about whether we're defunding the police or whether every police officer is somehow racist automatically. I think those are helpful paradigms to an extent, but ultimately they tend, in my view, to be unhelpful in that we don't get to the real problem, which is, what do we want our society to look like when it comes to the use of force? So one of the things that I've really tried to hold on to personally is, where does my faith guide me in thinking about matters of politics, independent of adherence to a political ideology, whether it's right or left, blue or red, conservative or liberal? Those things are all helpful, perhaps, but as Christians, I think we have a different calling, and I'm at least trying to force myself to abide by that. What does the gospel say about how we ought to be? How do I extrapolate from my faith what I think ought to happen, and not just which side of the political argument do I pick? Because once that polemic is established, you can bet that the gospel isn't really fully part of either side, because each side tends to have in it a desire to crush the other side, right? To vanquish the other side, just the way it works out, not because people are evil, but that will often hamper you or me from getting to the place where I think we come to a good solution for the problem. So anyway, I want to use Mark to explore some questions like that. Can our faith be a guide to how we ought to behave, and not just evidence for some positions we already hold? All right, the sixth characteristic is just repetition. Mark will, like you can divide the gospel kind of in half, and you'll see the same cycled story repeated, but it's repeated with slight variations in the second half so that you can build on what you've already seen with a slight variation. You know, I've argued before that the ending of Mark places us in the same position, or attempts to place us in the same position as the disciples, you know, the abrupt ending where there is no resurrection, really. Jesus is just gone, and we're told to go to Galilee and he'll meet us there. It's like we're supposed to get into the story and become the disciples. And I think the repetition that is there helps us get into the story, because frankly, we're getting into the story in the seat of the disciples who have all this explained to them, don't get it, and then Jesus has to explain it again in a slightly different way. And it's not, in my view, they don't get it because they're stupid. If they don't get it because they're human, and getting it means really dismantling a lot of the ways we think about the world and some things that we think are obvious in order to be a different way. And that's all hard to do, and particularly hard to do by yourself. Okay, 6 characteristics of apocalyptic literature that I think are going to be defining in how we go and read Mark, and provide value and richness to the stories that he presents. Do you have any questions about that? Is that clear enough for now?
Golly, I hate to admit this, but I lost 2, 3, and 4 on my notes. I don't know. Just briefly, could you say what?
Yeah. No, let's go through all,
3, 4, and 5 were.
let's go through all 6, because I did get carried away in the descriptions of a couple of them. All right, number 1 is meaning of the crisis is a clue to the culmination of history. Meaning of the crisis is a clue to the culmination of history. Number 2, radical dualism, contrasting of one thing with another. Number 3, the combat myth.
Oh,
The example there was a confrontation of Jesus with Satan in the wilderness. Number 4, secret revelation. And there I was highlighting the distinction between disclosure revelation to the average person in Mark versus the idea of the Gnostics of esoteric knowledge known only by the elite. 5, suffering of the just. And that was my exposition on empathy. And 6, repetition.
thank you.
So thanks, Betty.
Have these lapses.
These, if you just kind of get in your mind that these things are there generally, then I think that will allow us to kind of go back to them as we look at the parts of the gospel more specifically. Now, I'm going to move in then to the structure of the narrative itself. But I'm not going to do to you what I did to you with the Gospel of John, where I imposed this grand scheme on you. There are grand schemes that attempt to outline the structure of Mark and draw meaning from that structure, but I don't find them particularly helpful. And the reason I don't is because they seem a bit, if you thought John was strained, I think these structures are even more strained. And it reminds me a little bit of a child learning to talk. You know, in my experience anyway, I think children often learn to talk in sentences without knowing they're speaking in sentences. They figure out how to put subjects and verbs and predicates together and form paragraphs out of those sentences without having anybody ever teaching them any rules of grammar. They pick it up out of the natural structure of speech and what seems to be good in conveying information and modeling off what they hear. And I think the structures of the Gospel of Mark look a lot like that to me. It's like, I think Mark did what he did because it made sense and because it helped him to convey his meaning and because it parallels some of the patterns you can see in life. I don't think Mark sat down with an infinity curve as a structure that I think I like the best. So you know how an infinity looks like a sideways 8 almost. You can design Mark so it begins kind of in the beginning of that bottom loop, runs up, back through the middle. That's one part of the gospel, runs back. That's a second part of the gospel. The narrative bridge would be the healing of Bethsaida, right? Well, that's fine. But it doesn't add a lot to me to the gospel. And I don't think Mark started with an infinity sign and structured his narrative around it. I think he built it in a more intuitive way because it works to convey information. So my image there is of a child learning how to talk. And gosh, I bet I was in high school before anybody ever taught me any grammar. And even then, I don't think I really learned it until we studied French. And even then, I didn't really get that part until I studied Greek in seminary. And I was a lot older then. And yet I talk fine, I think, for a Southerner. And, and that's just because my mama taught me how to talk, you know. So anyway, you can look in the commentaries for those structures, and I'm happy to discuss them with you, but we're not going to take up a lot of class time doing that. I do want you to pay particular attention, though, to the imagery that Mark uses. Mark spends a lot of time showing us stuff, but not a lot of time telling us about stuff. He will show us something without elaborate commentary, right? He was a good writer, probably no preacher. He's not telling you what he showed you, he's just showing it to you. So even though it seems short and, you know, kind of punctiliar and rapid in its pace, I think it's good to pause and read it contemplatively, kind of really savor the images that are offered and the stories that are told, and pay attention to the sequencing of those stories, because they're rich with meaning. They're rich with meaning. And then I will later tell you how one kind of replicates another, how you'll see a story in the prologue that looks like it's being picked up and enhanced in another part of the gospel. Okay. Any questions about structure, or are you just thankful that I'm not going to drag you through this structural diagram? Okay. Well, I want to finish then by, I mean, I've asked you to read the prologue, but I don't want to jump into talking about the prologue quite yet. I'm more interested in kind of what your perceptions of the gospel are in general. They don't have to be right, but I'm curious of what when you come to the gospel, Mark, what are you bringing to the gospel? What do you think about it before we start analyzing it in detail? Before we crush the life out of it, what did you think Mark was about?
George,
Did you-
I appreciate,
Oops, go ahead.
I was just saying, I appreciated the fact that you said that Mark was interested in showing us something, because I always saw Mark as, and now it makes more sense to me, because I always saw him as being very action oriented. He would say things that would describe something that was very intense, like, you know, when he's describing the baptism of Jesus, you know, the heavens were torn open. I mean, these are very vivid images for me. So, I mean, that's one of the things that I've always thought about Mark. It didn't really, as you say, give a backstory so much as to say, this is what happened. And it was a very intense, if not vibrant situation. And, you know, it served to, I think, you know, just make a big impression on whoever was listening or whoever was there.
Yeah, thank you, Melody. I think that's right. I think that's right. And as a result, I think I appreciate Mark. John is my favorite gospel, as you probably can imagine, but I do think that Mark, I like it more and more every time I read it.
That image of, you know, tearing open the heavens. Well, there's that passage I love in Isaiah, and I didn't realize it came from, it says, why don't you tear open the heavens and come down? And he's using that. And I didn't realize that he, you know, how he was going back to the Hebrew scriptures like that.
Yeah, that I'm learning a lot about that myself. I think I've referenced to you before the Richard Hayes, who was a professor at Duke, who wrote a book called Reading Backwards, which actually goes through the Gospels and talks about intertextuality, that is the reliance both implicitly and explicitly on the Hebrew scriptures. And it's fascinating to me. It was like, I just can't even imagine a New Testament separated from the Hebrew scriptures now. It's like, it would be nonsensical.
Well,
George, answer your question.
we tell stories from from our own culture and our own environment. And I feel like the gospel, particularly of Mark, is being told by this Jewish believer, and the action is, he wants to tell us quickly and doesn't want to be distracted by anything except to move ahead with this story that means so much to him. And it has energy because it moves so quickly. And it draws you in as if you were an observer. And that's what I like about the Gospel of Mark. You don't have to slow down. You really just have to move with him, with his energy and his excitement.
I love that. You know, when I started practicing law, one of the early research memos I turned in came back with a lot of red ink on it. And one of the things my partner said is, I wish you would move with greater alacrity. I had to look the word up, but I have not forgotten it. It means cheerful promptness. And I do think of Mark as having great alacrity there. That's a good insight.
I would like to add to what Bonnie just said, that I heard from one of the priests that's no longer at St. Philip's one time, what he thought maybe Mark was about, that he was very, very young and became friends with some of the apostles and felt impelled to write quickly what he knew, because he was afraid that nobody else was writing, I think. I mean, this was John Mark Biggers I did the altar for him, and he discussed that he felt like maybe Mark was very young, friends of the disciples, and was motivated to write everything down as fast as he could for fear it would be lost.
Yeah, there is a tradition that that he basically was a scribe for Peter.
Yes, that was.
Yeah.
Is there any information that he may have been the young man in the garden that night who escaped with them pulling the robe off and he ran away naked?
Yeah.
Have you ever heard that?
I've not heard that was Mark.
I have heard that was Mark.
Okay, it was speculation, of course, isn't it, Bonnie? But I did a devotional on what I had heard that day for one of the board meetings of somebody, and thought of him as a 15-year-old who thought, oh my gosh, here my mama has dressed me up in this fine linen robe, and I'm here and have no business being here. I better get out of here in a hurry. And I thought he was 14 or 15. I don't know. I just imagined all that. But then I'm prone to kind of do some backstories, and maybe I shouldn't do that too much. But that was my feeling about it. Having had reared an adolescent boy, I just had that picture in my mind. Okay.
That's great. That is great. Charles, did you have a comment earlier?
I was going to answer your question. What were my expectations coming into this class? And my expectation was to learn a lot about Mark. Of all the four Gospels, I know the least amount about Mark. It's very interesting to listen to other people who know a great deal more about it. But of the four Gospels, this is the one that just kind of passed me my education. And I'm really looking forward to class. And bought the book as you asked me to do, started reading it. to learn about Mark.
Yeah.
I've learned a whole lot this morning. So my expectation was to learn something about Mark because I really didn't know that much about this particular gospel.
Yeah. Well, good. I mean, one of the reasons I've done the two gospels is because we get them in snippets throughout the year, right? But studying them as a whole, as a book with integrity, as a kind of coherent narrative, I think gives us a deeper experience of them and hopefully carries over to liturgy when you hear part of it, but not all of it. What else?
When I was in seminary, my teacher in New Testament said, everybody who's had Greek, raise your hand. And he said, how many of you got a B or a C? And if you got a B or a C, your Greek is now better than the Greek in Mark. And so, that made me think it was kind of crude and not very sophisticated. But then I start to read the book and find all these references and what it means, and I'm thinking that was not right,
Well, if Mark was writing in a second language, I mean, not the language of his childhood, that would explain a lot about it being rough. Because when we try to tell a story in a different language, like if you were telling it in Spanish and your original language is English, it would not be polished by any means.
George, I wonder whether or not Mark wrote that common Greek, not because that's all he knew, but because of his audience, that he was writing a Greek that his audience would know, not necessarily the elites, and that because the structure of Mark is certainly not simplistic or common.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. The kind of another alternative I would add to this mix, which is great already, is at least having really prized education, I somehow got pretty far along my life thinking that intelligence and insight were somehow related to diction. And you quickly learn that some folks who have not been as educated have plenty of good sense and a lot of insight and a lot of wisdom. And that wisdom comes out in the idioms that they use, and it comes out in the way they talk, but it's deep and it's real. So there is, and as I listen to these various kind of thoughts, it's interesting to me that a less than perfect presentation masks a real deep insight into the presence of God. That in and of itself might not be a bad conclusion to walk away from class with. Well, what else about the book? Do you have a favorite gospel? And if so, what is it? I've already revealed my preference for John.
I like
Mine
John
is
too.
Matthew. Sorry.
Probably Luke, since that was the Christmas story I memorized and all that.
Yeah.
Most familiar, maybe.
I say John. I love the beginning of John. There's always a new insight every time I hear the way it starts off. I don't know what it is, but it stimulates my thinking each time.
Yeah, it's poetry.
I like
I
math.
think
Did I hear Matthew? Was that?
I enjoy John because of the fact that there's so many pieces to it, or so many verses in it that that you as a child could commit to memory. I mean, that always brings John. I would say John would be my favorite, but again, I like Luke, who's the great physician. I appreciate how he writes about the healing process, and they all have things that endear themselves to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I sometimes wonder if my favorite gospel isn't a function and part of not only who I am, but also the context in which I'm operating, what my kind of challenges are. And if I were in a different place, I might find another gospel to speak more loudly than it does. And of course, I wonder if some of this, if the subversiveness of Mark that I'm seeing is real, if that doesn't account for how I never paid much attention to it.
Well, I think each one speaks to a different part of us, and perhaps to a different kind of person. And I love Mark for its its action and its movement that goes very quickly. And I always think of it, when I come to it, I think, oh, good, it's only 16 chapters and I can just romp through it. And so I think it depends on where we are in our life as to which one means the most. And each one is totally unique in its approach to telling about the same person. So I think that's why we have all four.
Yeah, I like that. One of the comments that I made last time was that the very form that Mark takes, that is a narrative, is different. And different, for example, than the document Q or the Gospel of Thomas, which are collections of sayings, which I think is true, were much more common. You'd have a collection of sayings being circulated, not necessarily a narrative. But the narrative lets us enter into it in so many different ways that I think it's a really powerful expression. Yeah. All right. Well, unlike my normal practice, I think I'll end on time today. But we will actually dive into the prologue at the beginning of the next class. And I, as always, invite texts and emails and questions throughout the week. If sometimes things come up among several of you, and then I can weave those into the presentation for the next week. But I do think it's fun to share our experiences of reading these Gospels. So if you could read the prologue and think about it, please do. All right. Any final comments or questions before we pray ourselves out? The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Loving God, you fill all things with the fullness and hope that we can never comprehend. Thank you for leading us into a time where more of reality is being revealed for us all to see. We pray that you will take away our natural temptation for cynicism, denial, fear, and despair. Help us have the courage to awaken to greater truth, greater humility, and greater care for one another. May we place our hope in what matters and what lasts, trusting in your eternal presence and love. Listen to our heart's longings for the healing of our suffering world. Knowing, good God, that you are hearing us better than we are speaking, we offer these prayers in all the holy names of God. Amen.
Amen.
Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God.
See you next week, if not before.
Okay, thank you, George.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.